Well, who would have thought it? Here we are between 60 days and 4 months out from the next election, and we now have undertakings from both major political parties that they see and recognise the need to reform some elements of the military superannuation indexation process. Shortly we'll go into the detail of the offers coming from both major parties, but the important thing here is for you to realise that ADSO cannot be partisan in its comments. We'll just produce the facts and let you make an informed decision at the ballot box when the time comes. But before we go there, we need to go and look at the history of what it is that we have been promised by governments of this country since DFRDB was introduced in 1973 and MSBS was introduced since 1991. It's worth reviewing some of the evidence given to the Matthews review by Mr. Podger, who had earlier done a review for the Liberal Party in 2007, just before the election. We came to the view that there was an in-principle case in favour of changing indexation. The in-principle case was based in large part on history, a sense of what did the members feel that they were promised in the first place. And if you look back into the history of DFRDB, you'll see that in the beginning there was clear evidence that the expectation was that the scheme was going to be somehow earnings related. Talking about DFRDB in particular, Mr. Podger went on to say, it was an outrageous scheme for the vast majority of Defence Force members because the vast majority got nothing. Addressing MSBS in his evidence to Mr. Matthews, Andrew Podger said, the MSBS is quite a curious scheme, and the indexation issues isn't only about pensioners, it's also about people who preserve benefits. The way the scheme operates is that when a member resigns from the ADF, and the vast majority resign after less than 10 years service, or 15 at least, their benefit is not real cash, and their notional account is held and it is preserved, but locked in at CPI. So you have to keep it. You cannot transfer the money anywhere else. You can only access it when you are 55, and at that point you have only been indexed to CPI for typically 25 to 30 years. End of quote. That goes to the heart of our concern with MSBS. Mr. Podger went on, if you were to ask me, as a matter of principle, I think there is a strong case in terms of community solidarity that retired people should not have incomes vastly different relatives to those incomes in the rest of the community. And hence I think there is a case for indexation measures to be more on an earnings base. Now, from that critical evidence given by Mr. Andrew Podger to Matthews, this is important because this point is regularly misquoted by the current government to justify having done nothing for a long time. And that is, Matthews in recommendation 4 said that if a robust index which reflects the price inflation experience of superannuants better than the CPI becomes available in the future, the Australian government should consider its use for indexing Australian government civilian and military superannuation pensions. Well, how do you bring that into context? I think this erosion graph says it all. There you can see the impact of the aged pensioners obtaining a wage element into their pension, and the Commonwealth and the military superannuants being denied that index, that wage component, and falling away progressively, so that 20 years later they are 40% below where they should be. This goes to the nub of our concern and why we are now so elated that at least in part both political parties are addressing the matter. Okay, let's now analyse what's on offer here. And we'll start with the coalition policy. The fine print says, the coalition will ensure DFRB and DFRDB military superannuation pensions are indexed in the same way as aged and service pensions. All DFRDB and DFRB superannuants aged 55 and over will benefit. Signed, Tony Abbott. Now, this recent announcement from Labor is different to the coalition's announcement. It is specifically 10 years older before it comes into play. In other words, Labor is saying their adjustments will occur at 65 and over, and there is no wage element. It is CPI and PBLCI, the better thereof, that will be used to adjust the indexation for DFRDB and DFRB people only. In other words, they have adopted precisely what Matthews said in his recommendation 4. This is a very significant acknowledgement from both parties, because at long last we have admissions to the effect that they acknowledge CPI is not hacking the mustard when it comes to keeping the living standards of our retirees at a level that's appropriate to community standards. ADSO has every right to be feeling a little bit proud of what they've achieved in what has been a long, hard fight. But we know only too well we're a long way from home, because we need to look at what's not in the two statements. Over 55 coalition with a wage base, over 65 for Labor, no wage element. Pure price inflation adjustments. But both sides have real flaws in what they're proposing, because that means for DFRB, DFRDB, under 55 in the coalition or under 65 for Labor, who are invalids or a widow or widowed, they don't get anything. And so ADSO will continue the fight to bring some rational thinking into this policy so that all DFRB and DFRDB obtain their entitlements for the invalidity and the reversionary before that age cut-off. It makes no sense to penalise them. Now, that's not the end of it, because you haven't heard MSBS mentioned here. You heard Podger acknowledge that there's a very nasty side of MSBS. And he told Matthews that. What a windfall profit for the Commonwealth, which they won't acknowledge in all their very clever accrual accounting. They hold millions and millions and millions of troops' dollars, and they give them a very generous interest rate of just CPI, and they laugh all the way to the bank, literally. They should be indexing at least to the same indexation mechanism as the age and service pension. And I believe there can be a very strong case that they should be indexed to the long-term bond rate, because that's what the Commonwealth's saving by not having to go out and borrow the long-term bond rate, because they can access the troops' money and spend it however they wish. So you might now understand why we at ADSO acknowledge the fact, sadly, we still have a lot more fighting to do. But in saying that, we must be fair to both parties and say, thank you for coming this far, but sorry, we're going to be fleas in your ears for a lot longer yet, because you haven't gone far enough. You're not delivering what the legislation says you should be, and that is, you should be delivering an indexation process that maintains purchasing power for all DFRB people, regardless of age, and you should be indexing fairly the MSBS components when the troops are still working for you as their employee, and you're still retaining the funds, and then when they leave the ADF and it goes into reserve funds, and further, if they elect to roll into annuity, that should also be indexed fairly. And it's not. A lot more work's got to be done. On Labor's side, you can't achieve what it is that you acknowledge needs to be done if you don't bring a wage component into the equation. And the Coalition, thank you for indexing to the aged or service pension indexation method, but please don't leave out the reversionary and the invalidity in either the Labor or the Liberal policy, because that is grossly unfair. And if the country is so broke that we can't afford to do this, then I think the politicians could set a wonderful leadership example by whatever it is that they can't afford, they strip off their own pension schemes and all those previously retired as well. And then this nation might have a lot more respect. Thank you.